Welcome everyone to this book talk on Dragonomics by Carol Wise. It is my great pleasure to host this event and introduce my good friend and colleague Carol. I want to begin by acknowledging the co-sponsors of our event. This event is being co-sponsored by the UCI Latin American Studies Center, with great thanks to Alex Baruki in particular. Also co-sponsored by the UCI Center for Asian Studies, with special thanks to Guo Chitao. And it's also co-sponsored by the UCI Long US-China Institute, with special thanks to Emily Baum. By a delightful coincidence, all those colleagues are historians. So we have a very strong presence of UCI history as well, bringing together China studies, Latin American studies, US, China, America, US and China studies. And it's for this broad audience, we couldn't have a better speaker and a better book to talk about than Carol Wise's latest book. Carol is professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California. Her research focuses on international political economy and development, with an emphasis on Latin America and Pacific Asia. She has written widely on trade integration, exchange rate crises, institutional reform, and the political economy of market restructuring in the region. Among her earlier works is The Political Economy of China-Latin America Relations in the New Millennium, Brave New World, which was in 2016, and Unexpected Outcomes, How Emerging Economies Survived the Global Financial Crisis, from 2015. And just this past year, Carol published Dragonomics, which is a tour de force on China-Latin American relations that is truly a piece to be read by anyone working in the field and on various cognate and related fields as well. Dragonomics explores the impact of Chinese growth in Latin America since the early 2000s. It is published by Yale University Press, and it received an honorable mention for the Tombini Award from the Latin American Studies Association. Instead of presenting more about the book myself, I will turn to my colleague Carol. She'll present on her book for about 30 minutes or so, and afterwards, I'll be able to ask some questions to get kickstart a conversation, and I'll then also help facilitate some questions from the audience. While Carol is presenting, I ask that you please keep yourselves on mute. You're welcome to use the chat function if you'd like to plop down some questions as they come up while she is presenting. I realize I also forgot to introduce myself. Apologies. My name is Gustavo Oliveira. I'm assistant professor here in the Department of Global and International Studies at University of California, Irvine. I do research on China-Latin American relations as well, which is why I'm such a huge fan of Carol and her work, and which is why it's been such a pleasure for me to organize and host this event. So, okay, without further ado, Carol, the screen is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much. I really congratulate Gustavo for his job at UC Irvine. He was at a postdoc in the East. Suddenly he pops up in Southern California, and I'm really delighted for you. You might not know it, but he's a gigantic rising star in the field of China-Latin America, and I quote him as much as I can, and I'm delighted to be here with you, Gustavo. I also have to give a shout out to my really dear friend, Dory Solinger. We've known each other for so long, Dory, and I bet you're sitting there thinking, how did she possibly do this? Because I was a very narrow-minded Latin Americanist when we met, right? So this will be the test of whether I really pulled it off. I'm so glad to see you. Okay, let me get going. I don't know if she's going to say something. Let me get going.
Just going to say, am I coming through?
No, never.
The second time that you spoke here at UCI. Remember the first time you had trouble finding the room?
Yeah.
I didn't give you the directions.
It was some kind of interdisciplinary mishmash of the buildings. And I was wandering around forever. That was on the, oh my God, it's a long time. That was on the Argentine financial crisis, I believe.
It was in the 90s, I think.
Yeah. So here I am, and I'm just so delighted to be here. Now, let me say that I have been a Latin Americanist by training, comparative political economy, IPE, and I had a public policy scholarship at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 2006. And there was a very talented, always talented, but a Chinese scholar there, a young man. And we met in the hallway. I said, well, what are you working on? And he said, well, I'm working on China's entry into Latin America. Now, I'm the Latin Americas. And I said, what's that? what is that, you know? And clearly he was a few steps ahead of me because that turned out to be a very big thing. So I waited until I could see we were in the middle of a gigantic commodity price boom. And it turned out to be historically the biggest ever. And I waited until the price boom had ended, which was late 2013, early 2014, because I knew if I wrote during the price boom, everything I wrote would be completely outdated when the prices fell. And indeed, it would have been. So I pick up the story after China has really both lent, invested, and gone in, opening up, you know, its own little, you know, factories and whatnot, especially in Brazil. So I picked the story up when China is fairly deeply embedded. Chinese foreign direct investment didn't pick up until about 2010, but we saw major loans from the two Chinese policy banks. And of course, we saw massive sales of commodities from Latin America to China. You know, these things are always exciting. You kind of ride them like a big wave, surfing. But when they crash, it's sad. So it always ends in tears. So let me say that I'm going to go into a PowerPoint, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But my book ends, it came out like the day USC shut down, March 24th, 2020. So I really go pretty much right up to the edge of the pandemic. And it's coming out in Spanish, it's coming out in Mandarin, and I'm writing, you know, an epilogue for those. But it's going to take a lot more research to figure out the confluence of forces in Latin America with regard to the decline of China's investment in lending, the decline of prices, and of course, this terrible situation with the pandemic. They are really taking some of the biggest hits, some self-inflicted, but that's another story. Okay, let me go into, let me share my screen, just bringing it up. Okay, I don't know if there's any students here, but if there are students here, you're welcome to the PowerPoint. It is, you know, open access intellectual property. Okay, so what was wonderful about this project, believe it or not, you know, once you're tenured, it's fun to do a book as opposed to before you're tenured. But I did a history of China-Latin America relations. That history is on the cover of the book. I walked into the Asia Pacific Museum. It's USC Asia Pacific Museum in Pasadena about 3 years ago. And there was this mural art exhibit. I had thought that it was, you know, from the Mexicans. It was two Chinese scholars who were quite elderly at that point, who had studied Mexican mural art in Mexico with some of the biggest muralists. So the book cover has, you know, it's got Zhou Enlai, it's got Leon Trotsky, it's got Frida Kahlo, and then it's got a combination of Chinese and Mexican revolutionaries. It's just wonderful. So when I did a history chapter on this book, I realized that yes, the 2000s is a new kind of relationship. It was just exploding, but that there was a very strong tie between China and some of these countries up until 1978, really up until the Cultural Revolution. There was sort of a whole chapter in history that I very much enjoyed. But let me jump to the present here. Okay, I'm just looking at these admits. Okay, so now the relationship, in 2006, here I'm supposed to be an expert, and it went beyond all of our expectations. It truly did, the relationship in the 21st century. For the Latin American side, it was really all about commodities. It's one of the most lush places with natural resources. So here's all the resources that, really China was desperate for. It was an opportunity for truly the very first time. There was a big borrowing spree in the 70s that ended in the 80s debt crisis. It was international banks, very unfavorable terms for Latin America. But this period of major capital flows from China, both in terms of commodity purchases, lending, investment, it really did open up amazing opportunities. Unfortunately, it's hard not to take it personally, but my region of expertise wasn't able to really capture those opportunities. I divide the cases up, and you'll see in a moment how I divide them up. But the big three, the big emerging economies, the ABM countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, it ended with a big thud. Then I argue that the three small economies, Costa Rica, Chile, Peru, that formed free trade agreements with China, actually did much better. Small open economies never do better at the end of a price boom. And these economies had learned a lot through the reform period in the previous decade. Whereas especially Argentina and Mexico had been kind of, skipping rope and, going through the motions of reform. But once the dust settled, we could see that they hadn't been very vigorous reforms. And I'll explain that later. All right. Okay. So 4 summarizing points. He's not here now, so I can speak about him. My nemesis. Everybody should have a nemesis. R. Evan Ellis. Every day he sends out some newsletter about, China as an aggressor, China as a threat, China overtaking the Western Hemisphere. And one common theme throughout my book is, no, I disagree. This expansion is not threatening U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. All that stuff coming from Pompeo and Trump, about what's the other one? Who was the vice president? Pence, about road to nowhere and debt trap and neo-imperialism on the part of China. I really beg to differ. So success, there's been a lot of success, even in countries that crashed at the end of the commodity boom, but it varies across sectors, projects, and issue areas. So you can find a really sound project in Brazil that the Chinese have collaborated on, and you can find a disaster. In most of the countries, there's, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Unfortunately, Venezuela and Ecuador are mainly the bad and the ugly. I didn't write about them because I was looking for theory expansion. I was looking for models in development economics that we could build on moving into the next century. And that was just nothing but a good old-fashioned resource curse. I think that, just an aside, those 2 countries are going to be fascinating as they've now got China in a creditor strike, right? A creditor trap. And how China is going to get out of that is a very interesting story. That's something new, for example, in development economics, the little guys, holding the big, behemoth in a credit trap. But that's for another time. So what I found rather, is going back to this history from like the 50s all the way up, what emerges is a very clear pattern of path dependence in China relations with Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. So what do I mean by that? These are ostensibly our more industrialized countries in Latin America. However, they started out one of my interesting facts was, say, 1962, in the throes of the Great Famine, both Argentina and Mexico sold grain to China for hard cash, right? And Chile had been selling copper and whatnot. But what we see with the three biggies, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, is that they have never, ever exported anything but primary goods to China. Now, this is counterintuitive because all three did major industrial drives. They did major import substitution, export promotion, and all of this. And certainly they sell industrial goods. There's a lot of intra-regional trades. Mexico, that's all they're selling to the US under the North American Free Trade Agreement and its, follow-up, but nothing to China. And so when I'm doing these research interviews, and I did so many in the region from about 1914 to 1919, it's these, sorry, Gustavo, but these Brazilians, it's like, oh, they're not buying our industrial goods. We're trying so hard to export industrial goods to China, and they just want our soybeans. And, my attitude to that is, well, what have you done to really upgrade and make your goods? You're just sitting there protecting yourself for the last 50 years. Mexico, it's the same thing. Mexico has the biggest trade deficit with China. It's $78 billion. It accounts for most of the trade deficit that Latin America has with China. Why? Because Mexico is so geared to the US that they have not, you've got to have, compatible products and intermediate goods going back and forth. With the trade war, which still isn't over, Mexico had a break because the trade chain between US and China was broken, and suddenly China was buying the goods that Mexico used to sell to the US auto market. So that was kind of exciting, though I don't advocate a trade war to get your intermediate goods going in the market. So Mexico had some mild successes in the 90s with industrial goods to China, but they weren't, they had always told the Chinese up through the 70s, we're not going to buy your goods because they're not competitive. And then very quickly, the tables changed. They shifted, right? And China's saying to them, we're not going to buy your goods because they're not competitive. So there's this, this is a lot of the tension. Argentina and Brazil have such complementarities with China that, they're getting along. Okay, love, hate, right? It's sort of like a bad marriage, but they're getting along. Mexico has a very vitriolic, very, very nasty relationship with China because there are no complementary. Mexico's opened up some copper mines and they've gone back into, oil and all that, because that's what the Chinese will buy from them. But from the standpoint of transformation, new development models, exciting things happening, all three of these countries are just kind of sunk, and I'll describe what that means later. I would say that my three small open economies, again, Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, did negotiate a new relationship with China in terms of these free trade agreements. And again, one of the most interesting things here was the room for agency, the room for voluntude, how much space there was for policy making, creativity vis-a-vis China. And one of the big ironies, as I said earlier, is that the small states were more innovative and more really creative in finding opportunities in the Chinese market. So I've got just a little bit of data. This is very typical of a commodity price boom, right? You can see, well, this is comparative long-term growth. Let me just see okay, this is the macro big slide. So we can see, you keep jumping around. Let me jump you over here. Okay, let's go up here. All right, so we can see the boom from 2003 to 2013. These are the good times, as my professor, Carlos Diaz Alejandro, always said. These are the good times. This is what goes to their head. And then we can see 2014 to 2019. These are the bad times. And the question here for me is, who's left standing? Peru's left standing, certainly Costa Rica, Chile. Mexico, a little secret here is that since entering the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico has never grown more than 2.2% a year, ever. And that's a lot of it has to do with its adverse terms of trade with the US. All right, so the per capita gains were phenomenal. Argentina and Brazil had been in huge recessions. Argentina had defaulted and gone bankrupt so many times. People had taken such a hit, and boom, we've got per capita growth really, cooking here. For Brazil, 2.7 was good. It's so big. So it was good. But then, here come the tears, right? After the boom, Argentina lost. It lost the per capita growth. Brazil lost. And then everybody else, managed to hang on. So gross fixed capital formation. And this is really were they investing in productive stock? Were they investing in, quite frankly, capital accumulation? China, I think, is at 45%. I think Dory knows those figures better than I do, 40% of GDP. But, these countries, Peru got up to 22, Chile up to 22, and for them, that was considered good. It's anemic by Asian standards. It's actually really sad. Okay, so let me see. These are because we've got 3 political clusters. So I take the work of Ha-Joon Chang, my favorite economist at Cambridge University. He's got the book, Kicking Away the Ladder. And I argue that Mexico, by just buying into the North American Free Trade Agreement, buying into this, Washington consensus reforms, it kicked away the ladder. It designated industrial policy to foreign direct investors, and basically has stagnated. It looks like they're booming if you look at the trade statistics and the wages in the industrial export sectors, but it has really been a very kind of lackluster ride for Mexico since the 90s. Argentina and Brazil, I argue that they have an institutional resource curse, and I take some of the literature, it's new literature on the theories of economic growth and whatnot, because in Argentina and Brazil, you still have an industrial sector. Venezuela, Ecuador, where you've got an authentic resource curse, there's no industrial sector to speak of. It's just export, import your food and all your hard goods and just hope oil prices are, running in your favor. So what you see in Argentina and Brazil is just an absolute decline in important things like property rights, transparency, regulatory oversight in these things. And then the data show that these 3 small open economies, especially Chile and Peru, did pretty well with the free trade agreement. The free trade agreement is interesting. Every one of those was proposed by China. Chile was the first free trade agreement. I think it was 2006. And the Chinese had finalized they were in the process of negotiating the ASEAN free trade agreement. And I had a wonderful interview with a Chinese trade negotiator, actually in the States here, who told me that they picked Chile to negotiate a free trade agreement with because Chile had a lot of free trade agreements and they wanted to practice, negotiating FTAs with countries in the West. So Chile and Peru, it's very interesting. What have they gotten out of this? They have gotten increased access to the Chinese market for things that really take a long time, the licenses and protocols. So all of the diversified primary goods, everything from canned, olives to specialty fruits and whatnot, they've gotten into the Chinese market. So the Chinese made this deal tenable on the domestic side because they let both of these little countries take, Chile took about 150 goods off the table in their small industrial market, and Peru took about 500. So the Chinese said, okay, fine, we're not gonna fight over industrial tariffs. They could stay the same. We want, they wanted the raw materials, quite frankly. In the long run, that was a great deal for these countries because there's been very little domestic backlash over this. Chinese exports are killing industrial goods the world over, but in this case, it's not because of liberalization of the industrial sector in these countries. Okay, I just want to see here. Now, I'm not going to go, I'm just looking at the time, Gustavo. I'm going to just, I think I've gotten my point across. Let me just, okay, my kicking away the ladder, Mexico, competitive disadvantage. One of the big things here, and this was shocking, and it was the way China was burrowing through the North American market in sectors like electronics, auto parts, and whatnot, that had been considered, really like North American sectors, and they were going to be, NAFTA driven, and this was going to be Mexico's stairway to heaven, right? And Chinese exports just started really displacing Mexico. And the data are here in terms of, Mexican displacement. And I would argue that some of that is, or a lot of that is adverse exchange rate and for Mexico, but also no industrial policy, none, right? And that hurt them, I think, really tremendously, and it's still hurting them. Okay, so Chinese foreign direct investment to Mexico is anemic compared to the others, right? Especially, look at Peru, Brazil, 48 billion, Peru, 22 billion. I need to update those figures. Okay, these are the free trade agreements. I've already described them. They all chose, the small open economies all chose to meet China at the level of public diplomacy, institutionalization of the economic relationship. And Chile is now the #2 exporter of wine to China, just after France. And it just displaced Thailand as the #1 exporter of tropical fruits. 20 years ago, if you told me this, I'd say, what are you talking about? So the Argentine Brazilian cases, this is an interesting kind of limbo because they're still selling hand over fist to China, especially with the China-US, trade war, and the Chinese, basically, not buying US soybeans. And so they're importing manufactured goods from China, selling massive amounts of commodity goods, and the boom is over. But I have to say that prices for goods coming out, natural resource exports coming out of Argentina and Brazil, have still been up, say 20, 25% higher than they were at the beginning of the boom. So when we look at these really sad slumps in growth and per capita income in Argentina and Brazil, I would say it was that they did no reform. They let go of all their reforms. So this is just one table from the World Bank governance indicators. I've got many, but what is interesting in this table, and it goes all the way up to 2019, it shows how Argentina just kind of just gave up. I mean, regulatory quality is huge, right? Brazil, it declined. The 3 small states have done very well. Mexico's hanging in there. But I just finished a paper on the Chinese Belt and Road initiative going into Central and Eastern Europe. And this is where China's very low ranking on regulatory quality starts to show up. It shows up in Ecuador and Venezuela, where there was just no public tenders, no transparency, all these, fast rail trains and horrible dams, falling apart, cement cracking. I mean, China came in with a regulatory quality record that maybe matched Ecuador and Venezuela, but these other countries have basically, the ones that are ranking high here, have basically been able to outfox China in the sense of, no, we're not doing another kind of sloppy, project here. It's not worth it. Argentina did succumb to 2 hydroelectric plants built by China and in Patagonia, the former president's home province. And it's just, you know, it's just a waste of money. It's not good quality. It's not good work. And so you could see Argentina and China are dealing with each other, and, you know, they're swimming in each other's low, you know, state capacity in things like regulatory quality. Okay, so this is a summary of the whole thing. I think that's it. I'm going to stop if that's okay. I want to stop, and I just want to open this up for feedback, discussion, insights. I love the audience. I have a lot of Asians in the audience, and I just so look forward to any questions, comments. You want to mediate this or moderate? Sorry.
No, Carol, if you want, you can take your questions directly. And we already
Okay.
have Alex with his hand up.
Hi, Alex. We haven't met, but I'm so delighted you're here.
Hi, Carol. Hi, Professor Weiss. This is great. It has been a great talk. And even in the most unsuspected context, I have learned a new way in which NAFTA has screwed Mexico. It's like every day is like a new thing. And again, thank you for the... I'm a colonial Latin Americanist. So these questions, no, I'm not a modern person or a person who specializes in modern economics or modern public policy. So this comes from like a common sense understanding from a Latin Americanist. I wonder to what degree, not only NAFTA, somewhat like marry Mexico to the United States in relationship to China, but also the Mercosur married Brazil and Argentina each other in their inability to establish an FTA, a free trade agreement with China, in the sense that they could not individually, Argentina, establish this kind of agreement with China, or Brazil establish this kind of agreement with China, but as a bloc, as the Mercosur, something that countries like Chile, Peru, or even Costa Rica could do. That was one of my questions, and to what degree that's in your explanations. And the other one comes to the issue of what these Latin American countries did with the money that came with the China wave of exports. I'm gonna give you one example regarding Uruguay. I'm from Uruguay. That's the only way I know something about Uruguay. And the Uruguayan government did from 2005 to 2015, more or less, use this kind of funds in order to de-dollarize their foreign debt. That was like a major thing over there. So foreign debt became dislodged from the dollar and created a certain sense of stability in the country in the long term, in the way that you could get loans, international loans, without much problem. I wonder if there was some other effects that are not just related, you know, with infrastructure or benefiting the internal market and increasing the internal market, increasing internal consumption, but relates to, like, you know, the things that are related to long-term effects, for instance, foreign debt.
Oh my God. So I have to introduce you to my doctoral student who's Uruguayan. He finished, he just defended, he just deposited the dissertation today. His name is Nicolas Albertoni. And he's at, do you know him? He's at Puque. He's got a job at the Catholic University and he's thriving. And from his dissertation, which is on murky protectionism after the global financial crisis, and 3 case country studies, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, what comes out of that is an analysis of Mercosur that is sad. It's so pathetic because it shows that Mercosur has been nothing but It's not even, you know, opaque. It's pretty transparent protectionism, especially on the part of Brazil and Argentina. And, you know, for the last 10 or 15 years, everything has been global value chains, right? Like intermediate goods or goods that are traded that, you know, you, like if you're going to finish an auto, an intermediate good goes from, say, China to Detroit, Detroit to Mexico, or whatever, and you need an intermediate good to finish the final good, all right? And so, and those are the global value chains. They're spread all over. Everybody's writing about them. And what showed up in this dissertation and in the data, and he's using the global trade alert, which is really good data, is that China, or, you know, excuse me, Brazil and Argentina have no global value chain for their auto production, which dominates Mercosur, and they're not involved in any other global value chains because they're so protectionist toward the outside world. And, you know, even Mexico is getting, you know, because of this trade war, we're in our third year, and Mexico is getting into some of the, you know, the Chinese global value chains, and that's huge for them. I mean, if only they could stay there. But if we see, you know, if finally there's an olive branch between the US and China in this sector, then, you know, Mexico's out again. But they're not even advancing, right? You know, they're not climbing any learning curve. They're not climbing any industrial, you know, technology curve. And it's just stunted them. And, you know, the free trade agreement with China and the EU, I haven't followed, with Mercosur, I'm not sure if it's completed yet. It took them 20 years to complete a free trade agreement with the EU that is completely superficial. So I don't know if they're doing one with China, but Uruguay should have left Mercosur like the year after it joined. No, I'm joking. But I mean, to me, Uruguay, didn't you also create a sovereign wealth fund? I think you did with the soybean revenues. Oh. Yeah, because you've got soybeans also. It's been very big to China. So, but let's take Argentina, and then I'll stop my long-winded answer. But that's very sad because billions of dollars were coming in from 2003 to 2013 to 2014 in soybean revenues. And that was another boom. And so during that whole period from 2003 to 2013, Peronist politicians took the revenues. There's a little loophole that says it doesn't have to be, the funds don't have to go through the provinces. The funds can go through the executive office because they're special export duties. There was like a 30% export tax on soybeans, millions, billions of dollars. And it went toward patronage. It all went toward patronage. By 2010, the bill for subsidizing oil, electricity, food, rent was $10 billion a year in Argentina. So it was like money in, money down a rat hole. It's very sad. It's very sad. But they just elected these people again. So I have to say, I don't feel very sorry for them. It's just round and round we go. The same people. So, you know, but that's sad. Brazil is in much better shape, much, much better shape. They just have a crazy president. Sorry, Gustavo. They have a real crazy president.
I'm sorry too.
Thank you for your question, Alex.
I got a question. Or two questions, Professor Weiss.
Good. Who am I talking to, James?
James, yeah, James.
Okay.
The first question is easier. You talk about the value chain, you talk about supply, all those things. I got a very basic questions. That is, when I am in Chile, when I'm in Brazil, in Argentina, I enjoy the wine, enjoying the coffee there. But I couldn't find it in Shanghai. Or I can hardly find any of those, or any promotion of all those good stuff in China. Why is that? That's my first question. We're not talking about anything of a long value chain. We talk about very simple, good wine, okay? We talk about very good, very simple thing, the Brazilian coffee. We don't find it there. And I've been preached my students from South America, why don't you go back? See whether you can start some business like this. Nothing happened. That's my first question. The second question is, I have been in South America many times as a businessman for Standard Oil, for Honeywell, all those, and now I'm a professor. And I constantly think about this. What really prevent all those countries you mentioned from a real good reform? Is that because the people, they're too nice, huh?
James, I'd get a Nobel Prize in economics if I could answer that question. Why do policymakers,
And peace too, a Nobel Prize of Peace too.
why do policymakers put off reforms to their own detriment? It's really, I'm telling you, it's a big one. You know, there's all these theories and models, but do we really have an answer? Argentina has been singularly so self-destructive for so long. And you just look at it and there is no explanation that's rational. But let me go back to, okay, so you're talking about wine and coffee. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, very simple stuff.
Okay, so I'm in China a lot. I don't see a lot of coffee. They've got these coffee houses and the young Chinese people are drinking it like young people here. But for the most part, it's still a tea place, right? And coffee is expensive when you go to these fancy places, right? Longhorn or whatever they're called. So wine, there is a taste. The Chileans have, you know, Chile's bulk wine, it's okay, but it's number 2 to France. And it's the Chileans that have been working with Chinese growers. They have trained Chinese growers to, you know, to produce crops of grapes. They've trained them how to make wine. So a lot of the Chilean wine, Cazadores and, you know, these big labels that are big in Chile or in Trader Joe's, but, you know, they're now selling in China. But in terms of China promoting global value chains, those are embedded in these huge state-owned enterprises. So, you know, and those aren't exactly transparent, but this is where the action is. I mean, you see whole industries just so, you know, engineering, construction, all of that, vigorously promoting, you know, a value chain, especially when they get these big contracts for hydroelectric dams in Latin America or, you know, high-speed rails and all of that. But the promotion is embedded in the very government. It's not like there's some new decree issued like, oh, we're promoting this. It's part of the economic fabric, you know, the DNA of these big companies.
Well, I see what you're saying, but my point is, if China really wants to expand its Belt and Road project, as you mentioned, you know, somewhere in the written introduction, I was wondering if there's no real trade going on, how could either country benefit from this so-called Belt and Road project? You know, how can
Bingo. Now, China, outside of Belt and Road, has built phenomenal infrastructure in Argentina and Brazil. Argentina is, you know, revamping of an ancient British-built railroad that's going to go through the Andes to the west and to the Pacific coast to get goods to China. So China is very aggressive, Belt and Road or no Belt and Road, in building infrastructure in countries that have massive, you know, resources. It's, you know, renovating ports in Brazil, building a railway in Brazil to get, you know, the iron ore out to the coast. But I just did a study of Central Europe and then the 5 Balkan countries that have taken BRI loans from China. And like Montenegro, Serbia, you know, and it's like, there's no there there. And this is a lot of, this is another subject, we're kind of going astray here, but this is a lot of the debt that's starting to blow up, mainly because what you're saying, there was no logic to it, right? It's just China, excess capacity, cement, construction, aluminum, Engineering services are the world's best. And, you know, so they're unloading their excess capacity, but these debt arrears are starting to blow up in their face. So let's just say where it doesn't make sense, it's not working out. It works out in Latin America, I would say about at least 60% of the time, because they want those goods to market. They want to get those goods out of especially South America and get them going across the Pacific. But if there's no structural logic, forget about it, right?
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions from the audience? If not, I have a question, but I wouldn't want to take the opportunity from Dory Solinger or anyone else who's here.
Dory's still shocked that I'm here. I'm joking, Dory. I'm joking. She listened to me complain for so long about tenure. And then I transformed myself. You can transform yourself after tenure. This is what I'm learning.
Well, and I would say that if you want to really understand international political economy in Latin America now, you have to understand the relationship with China, right? And if I were to ask you, Carol, a question about your book, it's the way that you take dependency theory to task, in the way that in the first, especially the two historical chapters, when you kind of lay, you know, what has that enabled us to see, the kind of like thick description but thin in explanation, and then when you walk through, you know, the three clusters of countries, how then that illustrates your argument. So the way that you frame this, the questions are: in what ways might institutional weakness condition the effects of natural resource abundance and economic performance? That's, you know, as I say, it's an institutional resource curse that you argue has happened in Argentina and Brazil. And on the other hand, how might otherwise effective institutions deteriorate under the force of a major commodity boom? Maybe it's because I'm Brazilian and that's the focus of my research. But the way that you show the path dependence of Brazil and Argentina, you know, and the lack of institutional reforms, and the way that you end your chapter on the three small open economies with recommendations for Latin America, not recommendations, but lessons for Latin America. How is this, this theoretical, say, recasting of dependency theory for the 21st century then, in terms of these institutional constraints, in terms of the kind of human agency that you say Latin American countries could draw upon in order to not be caught in those, how do you then recast that? There's definitely no longer the kind of, eclectic kind of dependentista kind of argument from the 20th century.
Right. Oh, well, Barbara Stallings just has this Elements book out at Cambridge on, dependency, China, Latin America dependency. We've been fighting. We've been fighting in public. People invite the two of us and we start, because I don't agree with it. Some big long review essay in world development by some big famous dependentist. It goes on, and at the very end, he finally says, it's a thick description of everyday life in many of the developing countries, but it doesn't explain how they got there, and it doesn't explain differences, right? The biggest example is even China itself, right? It was occupied, for the first half of the 20th century. They're still very bitter about, imperialism and all of that. And, how do you go from that to what we've seen, right? And, it's timing. They did it right when globalization was taking off. It's, all this, so many books, right? Barry Naughton, Justin Lin, so many brilliant books about, the managing their factors of endowment, experimenting, all of these things, right? So I don't, thank you too, Kenneth, thank you. I don't see it as a big explanation, because If it is an explanation, then you have to find some other explanation for every exception. It doesn't explain the exceptions. This is my problem. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of poor Peruvians, but Peru was the highest growing country in Latin America for 10 years. And that doesn't happen by chance. It isn't because they're selling copper and iron ore to China. They were already doing well, right? And one of the arguments I make is that the three small open economies, and I've said this before, they're usually the ones that get clobbered in the end of a price boom, always, right? Or in the debt crisis of the 80s. They've done the best. And a lot of it was that they carried out, bye, Dorothy, bye. So nice to see you, Dory. But they carried out a lot of the reforms. I gave a talk in Argentina before the pandemic in Buenos Aires, of all places, right, at Flaxo, which is a freestanding social science, master's PhD program. Anyway, so one of the guys was, Peronist left. And so I had other slides showing, the World Bank governance indicators around, transparency, effectiveness of government. And it's not just, he says, oh, that's just Washington consensus. You're just neoliberal. And so I said, well, okay, then what explanation do you have for the crisis you're in right now? That 3 days in Buenos Aires, the exchange rate went from 43 to the dollar to 59 to the dollar while I'm sitting there giving a talk. And he said, oh, we don't need institutions. We don't need this. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I have a plane ticket out of here. Sorry. It's like, whoa. So, but dependency, students love it. They love it. It gets them all kind of something at least gets them, animated. But we really have to move past it. And it describes situations, but look at the tremendous diversity in Latin America, right? Why is Mexico such a sad sack, right? Because it's dependent on the United States. Those are some of the choices that they made, right? They made those choices. And to stick with this, I call it a pseudo free trade policy, because their most favored nation tariffs toward all other countries are at the very top of the band, whereas they've got zero tariffs with the US. So that's the way they've been surviving. Lots of protectionism toward the rest of the world.
Thank you. We do have one question in the chat, and maybe just enough minutes left to address it if you'd like. Kenneth Waugh asked, appreciates the great talk and should not see any red flags for China and Latin America, at least, but more positive about the prospect. And then says, as a Taiwanese American, leaving aside the politics and reflecting on the title of your book, Dragonomics, makes him think about, what about the little dragons? I'm imagining here, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, and so on. How will they, work along, or how might they move along in this perspective? I'm understanding this maybe in relation to Latin America.
Correct. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Kenneth. You're from Taiwan?
Hi. Yeah, from Taiwan. Yes.
So that is such an interesting question to me, because if you look at the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, that was like, for China, it was almost like, to be honest, a charity case. It's like, okay, we're clobbering them, they're getting squished, they don't like it. And so we're going to integrate them into our own value chain. And, China will continue to be the factory, the hub, but then they're going to outsource to these countries where wages are so much lower, work is so much more scarce. And even though it's not, maybe the fast track up through the industrial learning curve, China has made it so that those countries are not dying under a huge trade deficit with China. It's made it, they brought them in. So the little Chinas, which most of them are in ASEAN, there's been a kind of peace pact as far as I see it, because China does, China doesn't need a free trade agreement to integrate them into the hub. But basically what it did, I mean, it's got the security shield, it can control them, it can push them around. That's implicit as far as I see it. But what it did is it brought them into the club. And it's, it's a, if you will, a kind of balancing act. Taiwan has done very well for itself. Now in Latin America, the competition between the PRC and Taiwan in Latin America in terms of diplomatic recognition has been very tricky. Now, if you'll recall, El Salvador rushed to China and disassociated with Taiwan. They have this port that is just defunct and no ships came, right? No crude, no container ships, no cruise ships. And they wanted Taiwan to rebuild it and to modernize it. And the Taiwan government said no. And of course, China, oh, BRI, yes, but guess what? China has now dropped that and said, this doesn't look too good. So some of these deals that have been made to woo countries to the one China policy haven't been the best deals for those countries. Now, I don't know if we're going to see countries going, back to Taiwan. They did for a while. If you look at the kind of the chronology of countries going one China, Taiwan, one China, Taiwan, they could. El Salvador is a good example, but I think that your country, you're welcome to disagree with me. I think it's done very well. You're losing diplomatic stature in, say, Latin America, but do you really need that? Do you really need that? I'm asking you.
Well, no, I'm fully with you. Thank you so much. Yeah. I got it. I got the answer already. I will make sure that President Tsai will get a chance to read your book.
Oh, that's so sweet of you.
Tsai Ing-wen, yes. She should. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kenneth. Well, Carol, we are at time. And I'm sure that there's a lot more that we could talk about. I myself have so many more things that I would love to pick your brain about in terms of your analysis of Petrobras and the corruption scandals and how that in some way, shows all the institutional flaws in Brazil. But on the other hand, it also kind of left a space for Chinese infrastructure companies to be the only ones that can come in and do it. While of course, Odebrecht and the other big ones in Brazil were kind of hesitant to say, cede some of that space for China. So I really look forward to kind of seeing, where things might go from here. And I think
your policy bank is also, your development bank, I think, is also pretty sound. I do, but that's another discussion. So next time it's my turn to have you to my campus in person, hopefully, to present your book. Hopefully we'll be off Zoom soon, right?
Hopefully soon.
Alex, do you want me to ask? I'm going to introduce, do you know Nicholas Albertoni?
Actually, no.
I'm going to introduce you. I think you'll be interested in his thesis, even though it's contemporary. It is very telling of Mercosur, really. I'm going to introduce you in the email.
Thank you.
So send me an email so I have your email, okay? Good. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Hi, Lee.
Thank you very much. It's a good presentation. Enjoying it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.